Welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. Tonight, we're beginning a new series. This is going to be part one of our examination of the First Crusade. Tonight's panel is going to be me, J. Stephen Roberts, and Peter Safarian is with us. Peter, how are you?
Fine. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And our academic guest for the evening is going to be Dr. William Hamblin from Brigham Young University. Dr. Hamblin is a historian of the ancient and medieval world who has done a lot of work on the Crusades. Currently, he's creating a very useful repository of Crusades military history at crusadingwarfare.net. Dr. Hamblin, welcome. Thanks for being with us this evening.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
All right, great. To really understand why the First Crusade even got going, we have to take a look at what was going on in the world of Eastern Christendom and the Islamic world at this time, the late 11th century. So ever since the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire, which was essentially the medieval Christian continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, had been in conflict to some degree or another with various Arab caliphates and dynasties on their eastern frontier. However, as recently as the early 11th century, the rise of a new power coming out of the Asian steppe, the Seljuk Turks, had come to seriously threaten Byzantium. So, Dr. Hamblin, can you start us off here and tell us a little bit about who the Seljuk Turks were and how they impacted the Byzantine Empire?
Right. This is a very complicated topic, and I'll try to give you the good parts version. The idea of Turk is a linguistic group, rather like Germanic languages or Romance languages. It's kind of a language group, and there were many different Turkish tribes and peoples. Their homeland was in the modern area of Uzbekistan and around that area, but they migrated, much like the Mongols, in terms of social structure and economic activity and so forth, and military systems. They were very much like the more famous Mongols. These Turks migrated in a number of different directions, beginning in the 10th, well, earlier, but for our purposes in the 10th century. One group went north and west over the top of the Caspian Sea and Black Sea into the southern Russian steppe and the Danube basin. These groups were called Pechenegs and Cumans, and there were other tribes as well. Another migration went south and west into Iran, and these were known as the Oghuz Turks. Now, we call them Seljuk Turks sometimes, but that's because of the dominant dynastic family. So Seljuk is not really a tribal name, it is a dynastic name. And within the Seljuk Empire, there were many different tribes and groups of Turks. Now, the Turks had begun to be introduced into the Islamic world, much like the Germans were introduced into the Roman world in the 4th and 5th century. First, they came as slaves, then as merchants, then as individual mercenaries, and eventually as entire tribes migrating from their steppe homeland into Iran. Other groups were doing the same thing to the Byzantines on the northern border, with the Pechenegs serving as mercenaries in Byzantine armies. And in fact, a famous figure of the Crusades, Alexios, was a Turk, the son of a slave of Alexios's family. So in a sense, he was a Mamluk or a Ghulam of Alexios, just as other Turks were Mamluks of Muslim rulers. Now, the Turks came as nomads and predatory war bands. In this, they were a lot like the Vikings. They would migrate to people, they would attack and try to steal things, and then eventually they would migrate into regions. The Turks that came into Iran were just barely Islamized. That is to say, they had converted in the late 10th century, and their conversion to Islam was fairly marginal. And many of the Turks who come into Iran and then into the Byzantine world are, in fact, probably not Muslims in any serious sense. It took 3 or 4 generations before the Turks became fully Islamized. So what we see then is in the formation of the Seljuk Empire is a mixture of nomadic migrations of independent groups that had no real relationship to the Seljuks, and then the formation of the most powerful dynasty of the Turkic world, known as the Seljuks. Now, they came to power after the Battle of Dandan Khan in 1040 AD, which was out near the city of Merv out in Central Asia. That battle, they destroyed the Ghaznavid army and basically created a disruption of the political order in the Iranian world, which allowed them to conquer the Iranian world. This took about 15 years for them to do. In the process, they became the champions of the Abbasid Caliphate, which was centered at Baghdad in Iraq. And this gets into lots of different problems, but basically the Abbasids were a Sunni caliphate in Iraq, and the Fatimids were a Shiite caliphate in Egypt. And they were fighting each other over the area of the Syrian border. In 1055, Tughril Bey, Bey is a title in Turkic languages like Lord, so Lord Tughril, and it comes after the name. And it probably was in medieval times Beg, Tughril Beg, but it's now pronounced Bey. Anyway, Tughril was one of the leaders, the most important leader of the Seljuk movement, and he marched into Baghdad in 1055 with the permission of the Caliph and became the champion of the Abbasid world. A few years later, a man named Basasiri, who was a Fatimid general, actually conquered Baghdad and drove the Turks out. And Baghdad, for a year or two, well, for a year, was under the domination of the Fatimids. And it almost looked like the Fatimids would take over and become the sole caliphate, which would have changed the nature of the Crusades dramatically. But Tughril Bey managed to drive the Fatimids, defeat the Fatimids in 1059 and drive them out. Now, this then leads to the problem with the Byzantines, because as defenders and champions of the Abbasid Sunni Caliphate in Iraq, the Seljuk Turks' major ideological enemy was not Christianity, but was Shiite Islam of Egypt. The reason for this is that the Shiites threatened the legitimacy of the Abbasids, whereas the Christians did not threaten the legitimacy in the Islamic world of the Abbasids. You see the difference between those two things? So they would fight the Christians, of course, but their real goal was to fight the Fatimids and destroy the Fatimid Shiite Caliphate, which were the rivals of the Abbasids. So in 1069 and in 1071, Alp Arslan, who was the nephew of Tughril Bey, who inherited the empire, the Seljuk Empire, he raised an army to march into Syria and Egypt to destroy the Fatimids. And Romanus Diogenes, who was the emperor of the Byzantines at this time, what he saw was that the Alp Arslan was raising an army in Syria on the borders of his empire. And he kind of panicked and said, I've got to raise an army because he may be attacking me. And when Alp Arslan saw a big Byzantine army appear on his frontier, he decided, I can't invade Egypt at this moment because the Byzantines can attack me in the rear. So he turned his attention to the Byzantines and defeated Romanus and the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert, one of the decisive battles of world history. And this had exactly the effect in Anatolia, or modern Turkey, that Dandan Khan had in Iran 30 years earlier. That is to say, it disrupted the political order of Anatolia and permitted Turkish migration and conquest of Anatolia. So this was a decisive Seljuk victory. And it was followed by both the migration of independent Turkish tribes into Anatolia and then some official imperial Seljuk invasions of Anatolia. The problem was, for the Byzantines, was complicated by the fact that the emperor was captured by Alp Arslan. And according to the legend, Romanos appears before Alp Arslan and says to him, I've captured you. What do you think is a just punishment for you? And Romanos said, if I had captured you, I would either kill you or imprison you. And Alp Arslan says, well, I'm going to do something even worse to you. I'm going to set you free. And when he did that, it launched the Byzantine Empire into a huge civil war, because another emperor had risen to the throne. They couldn't leave it empty. And now you have different people fighting, and Byzantium degenerates into almost a decade of civil war, which, because of both the weakness of the army after the defeat and the civil war going on, the Turks were able to migrate into Anatolia and conquer much of the region. First they would raid, then they'd migrate, then eventually they'd conquer cities, and then they established a bunch of independent Turkish states, as well as a Seljuk-related Turkish state known as the Rum Seljuks. Rum is simply Turkish for Roman, and to them, the Byzantines called themselves Romans. They didn't call themselves Byzantines. So when the Turks conquered Anatolia, they said, we've conquered Rome, or Rum, and therefore we are the Rum, the Roman Seljuks. So anyway, what that did was create a huge military, political, social, economic disaster for the Byzantines, because these Turks had migrated in and basically conquered all of Anatolia, which was half the Byzantine Empire and probably the most important half.
So yeah, as a result of these recent conquests by the Seljuks, the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, began sending embassies to the west, to the Pope. The Pope at the time was Pope Urban II, and Alexios was requesting aid from the west against this problem he had against the Seljuk Turks. Dr. Hamblin, let's talk a little bit about Pope Urban. Tell us about what sort of man he was and how he responded to Alexios's request.
Well, Pope Urban was part of what could be called the development of the imperial papacy. That is to say, with Gregory, who was Pope before him, and Urban, and then Innocent and later popes, they were essentially seeing the papacy in a new role in Europe, with a more direct authority over secular rulers, and also with in relationship to other Christian groups with papal primacy and so forth. So Urban was a reformer. He also saw himself as the leader of the entire Christian world rather than just the Western Christians, which was somewhat distinct from the way the Byzantines viewed the Pope. Back in 1054, there was a schism between the Catholics and the Greek Orthodox. And basically, the churches began to split, and Urban saw himself as the leader of the Greek Christians, and wanted, as that leader, wanted to protect his flock in a sense. So he was a very active man, a very reformist-minded man, and a person who wanted to increase the authority, or rather, as he would view it, who wanted to clarify the authority of the Pope in both spiritual matters with the East and in secular matters with European rulers. Now, when Alexios sends him a message, he viewed this from several different perspectives. One was simply that as leader of all the Christians in the world, his responsibility was try to help defend these Christians. And so he responded to Alexios by saying, we need to send military support to our Eastern brethren. He also saw this as a way to in some sense, manifest his leadership of the Eastern Christians. But fundamentally, what Alexios wanted was small war bands and individual mercenaries to come to Constantinople, enroll as mercenaries serving the Byzantine Empire, and then to help him fight his armies or his wars against the Turks and against other groups as well. Pope Urban saw that message in a different sense and said, we're going to send fully organized Western Christian armies under European lords as independent armies, which will operate in the Byzantine Empire for both the purpose of defeating Turks, but also to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslims. So he, in many ways, didn't give Alexios what he wanted. Alexios got a lot more than he'd bargained for when he calls for mercenary support from the West.
And I think it's interesting, too, well before the First Crusade got underway, Urban did have a very pro-Byzantine policy. He was interacting with Alexios's court well before this. It was pretty early in his papacy, I believe, when he lifted the excommunication, which I guess apparently was still on the books of the Byzantine emperor. And so he had a fairly cordial relationship with the Byzantines. This issue of the threat of the Seljuk Turks, it did seem to be something that he kind of took really seriously, as we need to bring aid to our fellow Christians, to Eastern Christendom. Eastern Christendom is in peril, and it's our responsibility in the West to do something about it. So yeah,
I have a quick question here, Stephen.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter. What was your question?
So Dr. Hamblin, since you mentioned how Pope Urban is very responsive to Emperor Alexios's calls for assistance, was there any sort of animosity and in turn some reluctance by some figures within both the Catholic Church and in some parts of Western Europe to respond with aid to the request from the Byzantine Empire?
Well, it's very complicated because there's the religious side of things and there's the political side of things. And from the religious perspective, the average crusader viewed the Eastern Christians as Christians, but kind of as heretics. And so their relationship was, we're brothers, but they're also, these guys are wrong in all sorts of different reasons. And we see when the Crusaders come on the scene, they kick out the Greek Orthodox leadership in the various churches and monasteries and put in Latin leadership. So they usurp the Patriarchate of Jerusalem from the Greek Orthodox patriarchs that had been there, things like that. But the problem with working with Alexios was more of a political problem. For example, the Normans in southern Italy, who do go on the crusade, had been trying for a decade or more to actually conquer the Byzantine Empire and possibly overthrow Alexios. And the Hungarians also had some kind of military political problems with the Byzantines. Both these groups bordered the Byzantine Empire directly. The French had no types of political problems like that. So there was a set of political issues which manifest themselves in various ways, and then a set of religious issues.
One thing I've always found interesting about Urban is he didn't seem to be really pushing the issue with the Byzantines like, you have to submit to my authority. He seemed to be more interested in creating some sort of cooperative state between his papacy and the Byzantine court. I think in a lot of the books we read about the First Crusade, it's mentioned how Urban was maybe more diplomatic than somebody like Gregory VII. So moving on here, Western Europe at the close of the 11th century was in a state of this rapid economic, cultural, and military ascent. After being eclipsed by Islam for centuries, the West was now gaining in power. Just some examples of that: in Spain, Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile had captured Toledo from the Muslim powers of Al-Andalus. So the Christian powers in the Iberian Peninsula were kind of on the rise, challenging the Muslim powers in Cordoba, while the Normans of southern Italy had recently conquered Sicily, the former emirate of Sicily, as it were, because Sicily had been under Islamic rule. So there was this real sense of the West on the rise. This was probably the first time that Western Europe could really mount a serious transcontinental offensive against, these great Islamic powers in the East. So, Dr. Hamblin, how did Pope Urban envision this expedition to the East? What did he hope to achieve?
What Urban envisioned was a organized, aristocratic, feudal army under his indirect supervision through his legate Adhemar, who was a bishop, a very close colleague and supporter of Urban. He also probably was thinking of Raymond of Toulouse, who ruled southern France, called Provençal back then, as as the military leader of this. Now, Alexios wanted war bands of mercenaries. Urban said, we're going to do formal feudal armies with aristocratic leadership that will be indirectly under papal authority through the legate. Now, a legate, it means kind of a representative, but basically it's in medieval times, you couldn't call up the Pope and say, what do you want to do about this? And so the Pope would send out an official, usually a high cleric, to represent him, and that man could speak in the name of the Pope. It derives from an old ancient Roman political concept. So the Pope is not going on crusade, and he can't tell them when they're in Constantinople what to do, but he sends his close friend and representative Adhemar, who's going to lead this group. Now that's what he envisions, and basically he goes around southern France preaching. He preaches in general, but he is focusing on aristocrats and says, we want you guys to do this. His goals of this was, number one, to aid Alexios, provide him military support, to defeat the Turks and the Saracens, thereby rescuing the Eastern Christians, and in the process, conquer Jerusalem. That was something Alexios did not have in his kind of wildest dreams, that he could retake Jerusalem. What he thought is, I got to retake Nicaea. This was 30, 40 miles away from Constantinople. And so this was something Urban added completely on his own, that we need to rescue Jerusalem because it is under the rule of the Turks. We want to take that city. And that is intimately bound to his concept of the crusade as pilgrimage. If you don't understand that the crusade is a pilgrimage, you don't understand why they do the things they do. And then finally, he wants the unification of Eastern and Western churches. Those are his immediate goals. And because at this time in Europe, there was a spiritual phenomenon known as pilgrimage, in which the individual would go to a sacred spot, usually with some relics of a holy person like St. James in Santiago de Compostela and Peter and Paul in Rome and so forth. They would go on pilgrimage to these places, and through that pilgrimage, they would have an inner spiritual revival. The greatest pilgrimage was to Jerusalem. And so Pope Urban envisioned his sacred army not just going to fight Turks, but to go to fight Turks and then go to Jerusalem as pilgrims, but not just to go to Jerusalem, but to conquer Jerusalem and make it a Christian city again. So those were basically the types of goals he was aiming for in organizing the Crusades.
Now, Dr. Hamlin, there's this popular belief in certain academic circles that because of the conflict between Pope Urban and the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Henry IV, that the real reason Urban called the First Crusade was in order to somehow reduce the power of his rival, the Holy Roman Emperor. Is there any validity to that theory?
In a very indirect sense, there might be something to that. But Henry IV, there was a rival pope at this time, Clement III, who's called an anti-pope. And Henry supported Clement III and said he's the true pope. Urban, therefore, Henry simply rejected Urban's authority. And to send a crusade is not going to change that circumstance in any significant way. And so, in the sense that his prestige might be diminished if he didn't participate or that type of thing, it could indirectly weaken the Holy Roman Emperor. But this was all about the East, about Byzantium and Jerusalem.
Pope Urban gives this speech at Clermont in November of 1095, and it's kind of the culmination of this church council where a lot of the business of the church is being discussed. He'd been planning this crusade for a while now. It's I think there used to be kind of this old popular idea that Pope Urban sort of just gave this speech and it spontaneously created this crusade movement. But in fact, Urban had been laying the groundwork for this behind the scenes. But this was kind of him debuting this idea. And as you were mentioning earlier, Dr. Hamblin, the really interesting thing about the Crusades probably is this combination of the idea of pilgrimage and warfare. So this army that he's going to be sending off is going to be not only a military expedition, but it's a spiritual expedition too. And again, this is something that's pretty fascinating about the Crusades. You've got this spirituality, this kind of very intimately held spirituality, this devotion to Christ, devotion to his holy places, combined with this martial spirit, this military drive to conquer the enemies of God. So Pope Urban kind of launches the whole Crusades movement with this speech at Clermont, and he certainly launches the First Crusade in this instance. So, Dr. Hamblin, do you want to talk to us a little bit about Pope Urban's speech? We've got these different accounts of it from our primary sources, but we don't have his actual words, specifically what he said. What do you think it was about this speech that was so powerful for those that heard it?
It's hard to say. The speech was given to probably only a few hundred people at Clermont, and mainly, clerics and aristocratic groups. There was a big problem in antiquity, or in the Middle Ages rather, that there's no microphones, there's no, speakers. You basically speak to people that can hear you in your ordinary voice, which could be hundreds of people, but it couldn't be thousands of people. So as important as Urban's speech at Clermont was, his subsequent preaching from city to city to city was just as important, because he would retell the message to individual groups that could hear him and interact with him personally. Now, it's hard to say why this message struck such a chord in the hearts of the people in Europe, because usually they don't talk about that, and we don't have people saying, I joined the crusade because I felt this, that, or the other thing. We see reflections and images of that, but not necessarily direct firsthand accounts of why they did this for the most part. But it is, first of all, I think there is the ideal of penance, that the aristocrats saw themselves as sinners, which was very true, and they saw themselves as having the duty to fight because they were warriors, but they also saw themselves as sinners. And so I think what set them off was the idea that I can repent of my sins of being a warrior by being a warrior. And that changed completely what it meant to be a warrior. That is to say, now by fighting, I can achieve spiritual perfection and a spiritual goal, whereas before I was stealing cattle and capturing a castle, whatever it might be. So I think it is, at its heart, at least at the aristocratic level, it was a transformation of the perception of what it meant to be a warrior and how you could be a warrior for Christ. And they use this term, milites Christi, Christ's army, Christ's warriors, Christ's soldiers, all the time. That's how they perceived themselves. Their new Lord was Christ, and they were setting out to avenge Christ, that is, the insults of the Turks. They were setting out to set up Christ's kingdom in Jerusalem and so forth. I mean, so that's how I understand it. But it was very complicated, and probably each individual responded in a different way for different reasons. I don't think you can say everybody responded to Urban in exactly the same way. Some saw adventure, some saw money we could gain, some saw a kingdom I might be able to gain, all these types of things.
Before the research of some historians like, Jonathan Riley Smith, I guess he kind of revolutionized sort of our ideas about why the First Crusade was launched and what it was motivating the knightly classes to do this. Before that, there was almost this idea that maybe the spiritual aspect of it was kind of a fraud. Like really, this was a plundering expedition. This was an army that was hoping to plunder the East, but we know from our source material, and especially from some of the groundbreaking work that Riley Smith did with these charters, that this really was a spiritual thing for the vast majority of individuals. Like you were saying, Dr. Hamlin, there were some, maybe a few guys, like, I think if we look at somebody like Bohemond maybe, and we'll talk about him a little bit later, but you do see some individuals who seem to kind of have this idea of, well, I might be able to found a kingdom in the East. But for the ordinary knight, I mean, this seemed to be a very spiritual thing, and I think a lot of these individual charters kind of emphasize that. So
also, the fact that most of them go home after the crusade,
right,
indicates
exactly.
They weren't planning to found a kingdom, or maybe they were planning, but they decided it was not worth the effort because it was too much fighting, not good enough land. But at any rate, most of them go home. They make the pilgrimage, they achieve their spiritual vows, and then they head home.
And yeah, it kind of brings up this whole new spirituality. There had been this real tension, I think, for the nobility, as Europe kind of went through this process of becoming Christianized, where for these kind of warlords, these knights, these armed men, it was very difficult to reconcile this role of being a fighter and being somebody involved in these probably frequently rather petty turf wars going on among these different nobles from castle to castle, to reconcile that with Christian spirituality, which is all about sacrificing for your brethren, being Christ-like in your conduct. And Urban's call for the Crusades sort of fills this need in the Christian aristocracy to kind of help develop this military spirituality, if you will. And this is the thing that's really interesting too is this is going to have a major impact on the medieval world from here now. This concept of military spirituality is going to permeate Christian knighthood and be a important concept in Western Christendom, really from here on out through the rest of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, well, you see its culmination in the military orders during the Crusades, and then you see its kind of literary culmination in tales of the Holy Grail and things like that, where you mix knighthood and this intense visionary spirituality associated with the Eucharist and with the Holy Grail.
Yeah. So this is sort of the birth of European chivalric ideals, in a sense.
In part, I mean, there were many different elements to that, but this is a key component, certainly.
Yeah. Essentially, what the church was doing at the time, my interpretation of it is essentially saying, all of you brigands have been fighting your whole lives for gold or for women or for land. Now you can fight for God, and that will guarantee your sort of path to heaven, if you will.
Yeah. Well, in part, what the Pope is doing is trying to pacify the violence of the European nobility by saying you can't fight amongst yourself. You got to have the peace of God and truce of God and so forth. Mm-hmm. But you can fight somebody else. So you can, in a sense, he's redirecting their military impulses outward rather than inward. Now, he made, so paradoxically, it's kind of a pacifist movement, but it's pacifist internally for Catholics, not externally for anybody else.
Yeah, it's kind of, he's building on the concept of just war, because the idea is that these little like wars going on among the European nobility, these are unjust wars because they're just about land, they're just about greed, whereas what the Pope is saying is there's a legitimate target for a Christian prince, for a Christian knight, and that is these infidels in the East who are doing harm to other Christians. That is, what you should be targeting. And kind of on top of that idea of just war, he's making this a war that is spiritually meritorious. So that's where the pilgrimage element comes in.
Yep.
So it's
part of the paradox in all of this is that's the ideal, but whether that ideal is achieved by the Crusaders is an entirely different question. So you've got a lot of ideal versus reality in the Crusades as well.
And I think that's a good segue, if ideal versus reality, into the People's Crusade, actually. So Urban, he launches this crusade, and like you were saying, Dr. Hamlin, what he wants is these organized armies under the professional, if you will, military lords of Europe to set out. He doesn't really want these sort of motley mobs of sort of wandering bands to set out, which that actually ends up happening to some extent with what has kind of come to be known as the People's Crusade, sort of personified in this colorful personality of Peter the Hermit. So, Dr. Hamlin, do you want to just sort of briefly summarize the People's Crusade? What was it, and what happened?
Well, the Pope had a big problem in trying to get the crusade going, and that is basically there wasn't a king available. In a lot of the subsequent crusades, Second, Third Crusade and so forth, and Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh, a king led it, okay? He couldn't find a king to lead his crusade. And one of the reasons for this is that Henry IV of Germany rejects the Pope's authority. He's got his own Pope Clement. Philip I of France is excommunicated. William Rufus of England is in civil war, and the Spanish kings are engaged in their own struggle in the Reconquista in Spain. So basically, at a practical level, he's going to be able to get second-tier nobility of dukes and counts rather than kings to go on this crusade. Now, basically, it is also limited to France and Norman Italy. That is to say, the aristocratic crusades are. Little bit in Germany. Part of the problem is Henry IV, as he rejects the Pope's authority, his followers, his dukes and counts, for the most part, aren't going to get involved in a project that would increase the Pope's authority and so forth. The exception is the border kingdom of, or dukedom of Lorraine or Lotharingia with Godfrey, who's kind of on the borders between Germany and France in that regard. Anyway, so what he gets is these dukes and counts. The problem for Urban is that once he starts the message and starts preaching this in different cities, lots of different people hear this message. Some of them are nobles and some of them are ordinary people, and a lot of them are monks and priests and so forth. These people hear this message and they are completely overwhelmed and overcome by it, and they start preaching on their own. The Pope has said this, and here's what we've got to do. And so rather than getting, he did get some noble leaders, but he also got a lot of populist preachers who were essentially out of his control. We need to understand that in medieval Christianity, there was the formal church and the hierarchical church of the Catholics with the Pope as its head, and then there was the popular church or the ordinary church of lots of people who maybe knew who the Pope was but couldn't tell you his name, and they were much more interested in their local saints and their local preachers and their local holy men and monasteries nearby and so forth. So much of medieval Catholicism is very locally oriented, and this is especially true with the phenomenon of local saints and local relics and local pilgrimage. Anyway, so these preachers hear this message and they just start spreading it. And it morphs itself into lots of different forms. There's accounts of visions. There's apocalypticism, which is basically the belief that the end of the world is near. And a lot of people saw the crusade as going to Jerusalem to fight the Antichrist, to fight the armies of Gog and Magog, to retake Jerusalem so that Christ can return. So you have an apocalyptic element of this. You have prophecies being given. You have all sorts of forms of extreme religious enthusiasm that are taking place. Now, some of that was also occurred at the level of the aristocratic crusades. For example, discovery of the Holy Cross, the lance in Antioch. But a lot of it was also involved in other groups that just started to say, we got to do this. If I go to Jerusalem, I'll be saved. The end of the world is near, off we go. And so all sorts of strange religious enthusiasm occurs. For example, there's one group that believes in a goose that is kind of, manifesting the power of God. And just, it's just kind of a strange story, but apparently, some guys took that seriously. And so the differences between we should mention Peter the Hermit. He is the most famous of these because he has a person named Albert of Aachen, who was a monk who wrote a history of the First Crusade and early Crusader kingdom. And Albert kind of tells the People's Crusade as a biography of Peter. But Peter's story is very interesting. He goes on pilgrimage to Jerusalem before the Crusade. And there he has a vision of Christ telling him basically, you need to save my city, you need to save the Christians, and so forth. Peter tells the Patriarch of the Holy Sepulchre this story, and they write it down. They write down the vision, and this becomes a letter from heaven. That's what they call it. Now, it doesn't mean that Jesus sent a letter by mail to Peter. It means that Jesus gave Peter a vision, which they wrote down, and that's the words of Christ to Peter. So this was a Christophany. The ordinary people to whom Peter would preach then take on a whole different vision of what this is all about, which is more personal, more miraculous. We're going to march off without proper preparations because God's going to grant us victory. And we don't need to have armor and we don't need to have food because we go and God will grant us victory just like he did to the ancient Israelites. Ideas like that. So the big differences between the Noble Crusades and the People's Crusade was the People's Crusades, and there's not one, there's many different movements of this. It was not authorized by the Pope for a number of reasons. There's no clear leadership, whereas you have Adhemar and you have specific dukes and counts that are in charge of the aristocratic crusades. The People's Crusades, there's no clear leadership. Peter was an ostensible leader, but you find in Albert's account of the crusade that they disobey Peter all the time. He keeps trying to tell them, do this, do that, and they just ignore it. The People's Crusade was poorly financed, which led to all sorts of logistical problems. They didn't have enough money. The Noble Crusaders, some of these dukes and counts, hawk all their lands for, like, I think it was Robert Curthose of Normandy, mortgaged all of Normandy for 10,000 marks, I believe, to pay for the crusade. None of the People's Crusade could fund that type of money. The People's Crusade had a higher proportion of civilians versus soldiers. Now, they still had plenty of soldiers, and they actually could undertake sophisticated military operations like the siege of Mosoni, but they had many more civilians than soldiers, proportionally speaking. They were less disciplined and they were more fanatical. Those are kind of characteristics of the People's Crusades. And basically all of them fail in one way or another. Most of them don't even make it to Constantinople. Those that do make it to Constantinople are destroyed by the Turks in a big series of clashes around a place called Kibitot, which is right on the border, on the shore of the Sea of Marmara and Anatolia.
Excellent. Thanks for that summary there, Dr. Hamlin. So that's kind of the People's Crusade, and it kind of peters out early on. As you mentioned, Dr. Hamlin, there's that major defeat, really just kind of this massacre of one of the major groups of the People's Crusade under Peter the Hermit by the Seljuk Turks. But the primary armies of the First Crusade, that's going to be these armies have the Pope's blessing. They are going to set out a little bit later than some of this People's Crusade craziness. Really between, I guess it's between the summer of 1096 and as late as the first few months of 1097. There's really traditionally four major contingents, if you will, or that might even be not quite dividing it quite enough, but We've got the northern French under Hugh of Vermandois, Stephen II of Blois, Robert II Curthose of Normandy, and Robert II of Flanders. Hugh of Vermandois, of course, is going to be, he's the brother of actually the King of France. And then we've got this Lotharingian contingent, and this is sort of like an Eastern French to Western German contingent under Godfrey of Bouillon and his brothers Eustace III of Boulogne and Baldwin of Boulogne. And one interesting thing about this contingent, Godfrey actually had been, he was a vassal to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, and not too long ago, Godfrey actually fought alongside Henry IV against the Pope. He actually participated in the siege of Rome against the Pope. So that's always been kind of interesting to me. It just kind of shows you how. Yeah, it just kind of shows you the fluidity of the loyalties at this time, and maybe how it's like, in one sense, Godfrey is loyal to Henry IV as a secular, military lord, but spiritually he's loyal to the Pope, maybe, and it's probably kind of complicated.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Part of it is as a vassal of the Henry IV, the Emperor, he had to perform military service for the Emperor. When he goes on crusade, this is not in any way fighting against the Emperor. It doesn't harm the Emperor in any way. And secondly, he actually kind of divests his authority as Duke when he goes on crusade and passes that. I think it's his son. I can't remember who becomes the new Duke. But in a sense, he's saying, I relinquish my vows of vassalage to the Emperor, and I'm going on crusade. So he is in no way harming Henry's interests by doing this.
Right, yeah. I can't remember who it was that became the next Duke of Lorraine, but yeah, he does, he intends to remain in the Holy Land. He's one of those that doesn't intend to come back. But then we've also got this southern Italian Norman contingent. They're going to set out a little bit later than these first two groups, under Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred. And Bohemond and Tancred are kind of two of the more interesting personalities in the First Crusade, especially Bohemond. Bohemond is probably the only leader in the First Crusade who has some experience fighting in the East. He kind of knows what to expect to some extent. He also has some history with the Byzantine Empire. And then lastly, we've got the group that sets out after all the others, although interestingly enough, this group probably was the group that was most involved with Urban's planning early on, and that is the Southern French under Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, who is going to be the Pope's legate in the Crusade, and then of course Raymond IV of Toulouse, who is another interesting individual. Raymond IV of Toulouse was the count he was a count who ruled over this very vast area of what is now southern France. And he actually was probably wealthier and more militarily powerful than the King of France at this time. That's kind of one interesting thing about this period too, is that this was kind of a period where, the monarchs of Europe were going to become more powerful later on as we go along. At this point, they're maybe not as powerful as we might think of them as. And, some of these major dukes and counts kind of almost could rival the powers of some of the crowned heads of Europe at this time.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of the reality versus the theory. In theory, the king is the supreme ruler, but in the reality, many of his vassals were more wealthy and militarily more powerful than the king. So it's by no means cut and dry. These are all, and all these relationships are very fluid. People, they'll follow the king in a certain circumstances. They might not in a different circumstance.
And Raymond IV is interesting too, because he possibly, we're not sure, participated in some campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula. So some of these reconquista campaigns, these kind of proto crusades against the Moors in Spain. So did you have any...
I believe he's said to have lost an eye in fighting the the Muslims in Spain. Is that right? Is he the
Yes,
one?
yeah. He only had one eye, and
Yeah.
the idea is that he lost it fighting the Moors, which is kind of interesting and kind of a nice touch. It sort of adds some dramatic flair to the story.
Of course, he might have lost it hunting. I think there's no. It's kind of a legendary explanation of why he had one eye.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
You never know.
in this world, in the medieval world like this, there's all kinds of ways that a nobleman could lose an eye. So
Right.
so yeah. Did you have any further comments about either of those four contingents,
Well,
Dr. Hamblin?
I think it's important to note that there are that the Southern French, we call them Southern French, but they spoke a different language than the Northern French, neither of which is modern French. And so, although we kind of think of France as a state, in reality, these guys were as different as Italians and Spanish in the sense of being different languages and having different cultures and so forth. I think another interesting thing to note is that the prominence of Normans in one way or another in this, the people of Normandy were called Normans, but it derives from Northmen because the Vikings had settled in that area back in the 10th century, and these Normans are descendants of these Vikings, and one batch went from Normandy and conquered England, another batch goes from Normandy and conquers southern Italy, and then a third batch goes from Normandy and southern Italy and conquers the Crusader lands. So in a sense, these Normans were very militarily, had a lot of military prowess, and they were very expansionistic in all sorts of ways, both legitimate and illegitimate in these times. And so in a sense, the Crusades are involved with or tied in together with Norman expansionism.
The Normans are a big part of the story of the First Crusade. And Robert II Curthose of Normandy, the Duke of Normandy, he's actually the son of William the Conqueror, which is pretty interesting.
Right.
He's the eldest son.
Yeah, his brother is the one who ends up on the throne, William Rufus of England, but Robert was pretty jealous of that and didn't get along necessarily always well with his brother.
Hugh of Vermandois is, of course, as we mentioned earlier, he's the brother of the King of France, and he's actually the first one to set out and ends up petering out early on. He gets picked up after a series of shipwrecks by Alexios Komnenos, and ends up acting as Alexios's envoy to Godfrey of Bouillon when Godfrey shows up in Constantinople. So,
yeah, according to Anna Komnena, who's the Byzantine historian of this era and the daughter of Alexios, I think she and Alexios seem to have the impression that Hugh saw himself as the future king of Jerusalem, that he was going on crusade, and part of he was essentially the highest aristocratic level of all the people that were going as the brother of a king, although Robert Curthose was as well, but that he somehow had this concept of himself as the eventual king of Jerusalem, whereas it ends up being Godfrey and Baldwin.
Yeah, Anna, she records this letter that Hugh sends.
Yes.
Supposedly, this is a letter from Hugh. It's so crazy and sort of priggish that it's hard to imagine that he would send that. But yeah, he basically calls himself in this letter that Anna puts in his mouth, calls himself the Lord of Lords and the greatest king of all kings. It's kind of crazy.
I think it's the medieval equivalent of a tweet that he was doing. Right?
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between what he said and how the Byzantines chose to interpret what he said, and then how they chose to record what they think he said. So you get a lot of distortion in the sources because of transmission in different languages and garbling and misremembering and things like that. So a lot of times the primary sources have dubious and legendary elements in them.
Yeah, Anna's a tough one too because she wrote so late. I believe it was like the 1130s or 1140s when she was
Yeah,
she was writing that stuff.
she was an old woman in a monastery at that point. Her husband, when Alexios died, she wanted her husband to become the new emperor, and she essentially started planning a coup, and her husband turned her in, as essentially say, he thought this was a crazy idea. He turned her in and says, she's plotting this coup. We can't have this. And so she ended up in a monastery, which was kind of how to put Byzantine nobility in prison, was to send them to a monastery. And then she's sitting there all upset about things and writes this history, essentially praising her father. It is very adulatory of her father, Alexios, but then also getting digs at all her enemies, She's sitting in the monastery. So
including
it's fascinating book. She's an amazing person.
Yeah, that is an amazing book, and her personality does kind of come through in it.
Yeah.
I think she makes a few digs at her brother, who was the emperor at the time that she was. She
does not like her brother.
Yeah, John.
Dysfunctional family there. It's also funny. She was, I think, like mid-teens when the Crusades come through, and she was an eyewitness. She was kind of standing around in court watching some of these interactions between her father and the Crusaders. So she has lots of funny stories to tell about the barbarity of the Crusaders' behavior and so forth. But she has this description of Bohemond, and she obviously had a teenage crush on this guy, even though she thinks he's a barbarian. He's kind of like, this uber handsome, big muscular movie star type. And you could tell by the way she describes him that, wow, she was, impressed, had this crush. But she also didn't like him as a political issue, but in terms of his handsomeness and his size and muscularity, she just thought he was great.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about Anna's book. Bohemond is kind of like one of the central figures in the book. We had a scholar on who said actually that really the image we have of Bohemond, a lot of it is owed to the Alexiad. And
that's right.
Yeah, and yeah, it's on the one hand, yeah, the Normans are these liars or these cheaters. They're scoundrels, but there's this admiration for their military prowess. There's even one part I remember where she says that her father viewed the Latins as like the heroes of old, So, so there was complicated relationships all around between Byzantium and these various Latin factions, and it's interesting, and we'll get into this next time, I'm sure. Bohemond, his presence kind of introduces all sorts of tensions that may not have been there if he hadn't been involved. And then there's some groups in the First Crusade leadership, especially like the Northern French, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, were very pro Alexios. They seemed to have a very positive relationship with Alexios. Yeah, this has been just a fascinating discussion. Peter and I are very glad to have you with us, Dr. Hamblin. Is there anything either of you would like to add at this point?
I would just say, this is really, this episode really kicks off some really extraordinary turn of events coming up, and we'll really see some of this heroism as we dig deeper into the topic of the First Crusade. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, the First Crusade it's a lot of fun. It's a pretty unique event in history. I mean, it sets off the Crusades movement, but it's very unique among the history of the Crusades in a lot of ways. So, Dr. Hamblin, thanks so much for being with us. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and we're looking forward to having you with us next week.
My pleasure.
And you have a really good website. Let's make sure that we let everybody know about that. And you've also got a really interesting YouTube channel where you are uploading some regular videos about Crusades history, really from a military history perspective. Can you just tell everybody where your website can be found and a little bit about your YouTube channel, maybe?
Well, they're both called Crusading Warfare, and the web page is crusadingwarfare.net, and the YouTube channel is just called Crusading Warfare. And basically, I have, I'm a retired professor, and I've been studying the Crusades on and off for decades. And now, as I've retired, I've decided to work through all the primary sources and I've done a lot on the Crusades, but never actually read everything from start to finish. And it's kind of a big multi-year project, but from this, I'm trying to develop some kind of using new computer technology to create an atlas of the military history of the Crusades. So that's what's kind of starting on these two, Crusading Warfare webpage and YouTube channel.
Yeah, very useful stuff, and we'll link that in the description box for this podcast. So,
thanks.
Yeah, thanks again for being with us. And Peter, I want to thank you for co-hosting with me.
Absolutely. Thanks again for the invitation, and thank you for joining us today, Dr. Hamblin.
My pleasure.
All right, and this has been the Real Crusades History Podcast. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. We release a new YouTube video or podcast every Monday. So thanks. Thanks for watching. Click the subscribe button below to subscribe to this channel. To support Real Crusades History, click on the link to our Patreon in the box below this video. Also, you will find a link to my novel, Why Does the Heathen Rage? A tale of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Check out Scott Amos's novel, To Shine with Honor, a story of the First Crusade. Also, check out Helena Schroeder's biographical novel of Balian of Ibelin, Envoy of Jerusalem. Please click on the link below to like our Facebook page as well. You can also join the Real Crusades History discussion group on Facebook. Thank you.